Fora TV. The world is thinking.
All the culprits for Russia's democratization failing, for autocracy prevailing, have only, in some sense, grown. The monsters have grown. Things have not gotten any better. My general prediction is that, in fact, just from a purely structural point of view, that the chances for any sort of movement away from autocracy are very low in the near term, and very low in the distant future as well. Let's say over the next 10 to 15 to 20 years. But we can't just stop there, because these numbers and these statistical models only get us about halfway. We've got to entertain, the question of what ordinary people think about this autocracy. Despite all these numbers that I've given you, and despite these structural conditions, if people didn't like Putinism, it wouldn't be as robust as it is. If they didn't like autocracy, it wouldn't be as robust as it is. And in fact, it's very robust. And the question is then why, in addition to these structural factors. And I really do think that popular opinion in Russia is very much behind Putin's project. It likes Putin, and any Democrat has to come to grips with the fact right now that there is something of a tension between our liberalism and our democracy when we look at Russia. As a liberal, I despise Putin, but as a Democrat, I cannot despise Putin because he's the choice. I mean, we don't know if he's as popular as the polls, the government-controlled polls show him to be, or if the elections show him to be. But most Russians actually like Putin and Putinism, and so who am I, as a foreigner and as someone who claims to actually value democracy, to say that someone who wants to bury democracy should not, in fact, be able to do so? Here's the way I think Russians frame the political choices that they have right now. And I'm just doing this kind of seat of the pants, looking at the country from afar. I've not done in-depth field work in Russia for a while, and I'm just doing this, again, really without a lot of kind of fine-grained information about current politics in Russia. It seems to me, rolling back to the early 1990s, that Russians really saw their choices between democracy and autocracy. A party-based autocracy or a democracy, an open polity. And they chose democracy. They thought that was a better idea than what they had, which is a partocratic autocracy. All right? As late as the mid-1990s, they still believed that the choice was between democracy and autocracy, even though what they were seeing was the emergence of a rapacious oligarchy. And that's why Yeltsin was reelected. There was a lot of hanky-panky in that election, but he probably actually did beat Zyuganov in 1996. But by the late 1990s, I would argue most Russians had decided that democracy, that open politics, in their society at least, leads inexorably to rapacious oligarchy. And so they saw the choice by the year 2000 as between rapacious oligarchy and arbitrary autocracy. They thought that democracy in their country ultimately becomes rapacious oligarchy. Now, why would they think that? Because that was their experience. Are they aware of the fact that it wasn't real democracy? Of course they are. Are they aware of the fact that it requires a lot of work to actually build a democracy? You've got to have a reasonably stable civil society and get out there and participate in politics, not just in elections. Of course they are, but Russians don't like to do that stuff. They don't like to join organizations and work in groups and form social movements and do all that stuff. For a short movement, a minority did in the early 1990s, but they don't like that stuff. And so they know that in the absence of the energy required to make democracy work, which they don't have, they have other things to do, their choice is between arbitrary autocracy and rapacious oligarchy. And they have chosen the latter, they've chosen arbitrary autocracy. All right? Well, that was a wise choice. That was actually the choice that almost everybody throughout human history makes when you're faced with that choice between arbitrary autocracy and rapacious oligarchy. Most of humanity, most of the time, faces that choice. The possibility of open politics, of controlling the state yourself, is actually only on the agenda for certain precious moments in certain countries. Most people face the choice that Russians face right now, and they make the choice that Russians did. Why would they make that choice? Why would they favor arbitrary autocracy to rapacious oligarchy? Well, generally, life is better under an arbitrary autocrat if the autocrat is a little bit enlightened. Under an arbitrary autocracy, there is some possibility of two good things happening. That is, those things are the ruler has some concern for popular welfare, and the ruler has some concern for national glory and national greatness. Under rapacious oligarchies, neither one of those are even hypothetically possible. The oligarchs are not in the business of doing anything other than stealing, and that's exactly what Russia's oligarchs did in the 1990s. And it's not accidental that, in fact, Russia's greatness in the world, in the perceptions of most ordinary Russians, fell precipitously during the rule of these rapacious oligarchs. Oligarchs are not concerned with national glory and national unity and the country's place in the world. They can't be. They don't solve that collective action problem necessary to actually do that. What's more, generally speaking, oligarchs are not in the business of guaranteeing popular welfare. Arbitrary autocrats they can be concerned with both of those things, and Putin is concerned with both of those things. So their experience so far with arbitrary autocracy has been quite good. Now, why not some sort of constrained autocracy? Well, the arbitrariness is absolutely crucial in order for the autocrat to have the power to pull down the oligarchs without having to resort to all kinds of legal niceties, although Putin likes to wrap these things up in legal niceties. But nevertheless, people want the autocrat to have the arbitrary power he does. That's precisely what gives him the ability to pull down the oligarchs, to humiliate them, and to raise Russia up as a great power in the world. They don't want him constrained by the law, and he is not. And for all the talk about the dictatorship of law, which we haven't heard much about for the last half decade or so, people don't want the president to actually have to obey the law in Russia. That would be a humiliation to the president, and it also would be a humiliation to the country. It would be bad for his ability to actually pull down the oligarchs and guarantee Russia's greatness in the world and some sort of minimum kind of standard of living for ordinary people. And Putin has proven himself committed, very strongly committed, both to increasing popular welfare on the part of the previously marginalized sectors and, of course, above all, to raising Russia's profile in the world.